Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So recently I did a video reviewing the fight at the Tower of Joy from Game of Thrones, and this stimulated yet more discussion about everyone's favourite topic, maybe not everyone's, but lots of people's favourite topic, dual wielding. Now, something came up in the comments underneath that video that I thought was worth making a short video about just by itself, and that is the question of ambidexterity and double wielding, dual wielding. And quite simply, let's start at the beginning. Dual wielding was a historical thing in Europe and has been done in various other cultures around the world. We can see dual wielding in Krabi Krabong, we can see it in Japanese martial arts, Chinese martial arts, and indeed in European martial arts as well. We can see it with paired swords in the Bolognese traditions, we can see it done with so-called side swords and also with rapiers, and there's a fair amount of evidence that it was done earlier on as well. There was a type of Roman gladiator called the Dimachos who had two swords, but equally in the earlier Middle Ages there's occasionally anecdotal evidence that two swords were used together. It wasn't a common thing. Why? Because generally speaking, using a sword and shield is better than using two swords. Both in a battlefield situation and I would argue probably in a duel situation as well. The person with a sword and shield in most situations has an advantage over a person with two swords. The reason it's done a lot on modern film and TV is because it looks cool, it looks fun to look at, you can do more exciting choreography with it, and it's a sort of artistic shorthand for showing that this person is a badass. They can use two swords at the same time and twirl around and look really fancy. Now that's not to say that it's a rubbish combination, it has some advantages. I know some people who are very good at using paired swords together, Mark Gilbert to name check someone, and for anybody who's in the UK and been to fight camp for example, you will know Mark Gilbert is an incredibly competent fighter. I don't know anybody who would question that, certainly with swords. And the fact of the matter is that he can use two swords very effectively, and if he's using two swords and you're using a long sword, most of the time he will beat you. So there are people who can use two swords very well. Is it a kind of kick-ass combination, something that trumps everything else? No, it's not. There are advantages and disadvantages to using two swords together, just as there are using any other two weapons together. My personal opinion is that by and large, a sword and shield is more advantageous than two swords, and I would say that sword and buckler is probably roughly equivalent to using two swords together as well. Equally, sword and dagger, and of course we know that sword and buckler and sword and dagger, or rapier and dagger as well, were very popular combinations to use, and they are a form of dual wielding. If you use two swords, it's not that different to using a sword and dagger ultimately. Yes, both objects are the same length and that brings in certain problematic things, but nevertheless two swords has some advantages and some disadvantages. Now the question of ambidexterity. Now I have very far back memories of the fact that in certain role-playing game systems, and I believe possibly in some computer game, sort of computer game based RPGs as well, you need to be ambidextrous or have ambidexterity as a skill. Is it a skill? I don't know. I thought it was kind of you were ambidextrous or you weren't. But anyway, you had to have this as a skill or some kind of innate ability to be able to use two swords without suffering a big kind of minus modifier to your skill. Now this is just kind of rubbish, okay? If you can use a sword and shield or a sword and dagger, why wouldn't you be able to use two swords? It makes no sense to say to use a thing in each hand. You have to have some sort of innate ability or specially learned skill to do that. Hello, knife and fork, okay? Do we all have some special skill to be able to use a knife and a fork together? No, we don't. We just use a knife and a fork. We've got two hands. We can do two things. There are all sorts of sports where you know, take tennis for example. You serve with tennis. You throw the ball up in the air. You hit it with the racket. Yes, you're taking turns, and then some of you will say, oh, well, what you're doing is you're using the fork and then you're using... No, a lot of the time you're using the two things together, you know. We've got two hands, we can use both of them at the same time. We don't suddenly become massively impeded if we try and use two objects at the same time. In some situations, you might find, because yes, you can argue we only have one brain and you only have one set of eyes and they can only look in the same direction at the same time. unless you've got something wrong with your eyes. But so therefore, if you're only using one weapon, you can devote a little bit more subtlety and attention to that one object, possibly, maybe, debatably. However, as I keep coming back to, sword and shield, spear and shield, pretty much one of the most common weapon sets throughout certainly European history. And really, if you can use a sword and shield or a spear and shield, you shouldn't really suffer any disadvantage to trying to use two swords at the same time. Now, that's not to say that using two swords is easy. It is not. And it was recognised certainly in Renaissance Italy as essentially something that you would learn in a fencing school, and it was, skillful. There was a challenge to it, and the reason for that is because both the objects are similar. If we look at rapier and dagger, for example, the two objects are used very differently to each other. Same thing with sword and buckler. Certainly in Bolognese sword and buckler, the buckler's more or less kept out at arm length. Notice I'm using a knife and fork here. If you go to any HEMA events, at some point talking about HEMA will devolve into people demonstrating techniques with knives and forks. But anyway, if I've got a buckler held at arm's length and I'm using a sword, yes, the sword is doing very different types of actions to the buckler. So that's what helps your brain to separate those two things and go, okay, with my shield or with my buckler, I keep that here. Maybe sometimes I cover the head with it. Maybe sometimes I move it left to right, this type of thing. But the sword is doing very different things, and mostly I'm attacking, very occasionally defending with the sword, but mostly I'm attacking with the sword, and mostly I'm defending with the shield or buckler. Yes, you can attack with the buckler or the shield, and yes, you can defend with the sword, but usually the weapon, the sword, is more of an attacking role, and the shield or buckler is more of a defensive role. So it divides more easily, and you can say it's a bit like the knife and fork. They have very different roles. Clearly you cut with the knife and you pierce and eat with the fork, if you've learnt to use your cutlery properly. So when you come to two swords, it is fair to say that the sword is more complicated in the sense because unless you just use one sword for defending and one sword for attacking, which would mean that you're essentially doing more like rapier and dagger or more like sword and buckler, unless you do that, if you're using both weapons to attack and to defend, that does give more things for your brain to deal with. So therefore, yes, learning to use two swords together, both to attack and both to defend, is more complicated, although it's not hugely more complicated. As I say, it is not that different to using rapier and dagger or sword and shield. Just to make my point a little bit, here I'm just showing some very, very simple moves with the two swords together. They're not the same type of sword, but they are both arming swords, both one-handed swords of a similar weight. And you can see that I can move them independently of each other, or I can move them together. I can do similar movements with each, or I can do different movements with each. I should add that I'm being especially careful with these swords, given that they are both very sharp and I use them for test cutting fairly often. So there we go, guys. I hope that's addressed some of the issues to do with dual wielding. Yes, it was historically done. No, it's generally speaking in most situations not as good as sword and shield. Certainly on a battlefield situation it's not as good because you don't have a shield to protect you from missile weapons and things like this. And it only protects you if you can see to defend. For example, if someone attacks you from over here and you've got a large shield, it might protect you anyway. With a sword, that's not going to be the case. But you do not need to be ambidextrous to use two objects together. Anybody can learn rapier and dagger, sword and buckler, sword and shield, spear and shield, or indeed two swords together. You do not require a special skill or talent or innate magical ability to use two swords. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.